Thank you so much, everybody, for joining this masterclass. My name is Lorna, and I am the founder of Entheonation and the Plant Spirit School. I would love to welcome you today to this very special live masterclass with Manesh Girn, aka the Psychedelic Scientist, about the neuroscience of psychedelics and mental health. Manesh has had a passionate interest in psychedelics since his late teens. He's currently a PhD candidate in neuroscience at McGill University and has been a lead or co-author on over a dozen scientific publications and book chapters on topics including psychedelics, meditation, daydreaming, and the default mode network. He collaborates with some of the leaders in the field of psychedelic science and also runs a psychedelic science YouTube channel called The Psychedelic Scientist, which is where I discovered him. Now, in this masterclass, Manesh and I are going to explore some of the recent findings on how psychedelic substances work in the brain, how psychedelics can facilitate healing and help people overcome mental health conditions and live deeper and more meaningful lives. We're also going to look at what science says about the importance of integration and about the efficacy and usefulness of emerging practices like microdosing. Thank you so much for joining us today, Manesh.
Yeah, truly my pleasure. Thanks for the invite.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about your own story. How did you get so interested in psychedelics that you decided to study their neural effects?
Right. Through a number of ways. I think, well, mainly one side of it is experiential, and one side of it I came through it through my reading that I was doing. So I'll start with the reading first, because I guess that was first. So somehow in my teens, I got really into Zen Buddhism. Actually, I had a teacher at my high school recommend me a really classic book on Zen Buddhism. It's called Three Pillars of Zen by Roshi Kapleau. And, I was totally enamored by the concept of enlightenment, of purifying and stealing your mind as a means of insight, and all these concepts. And kind of got me interested into consciousness and this kind of stuff. And then I ended up somehow coming across the work of this LSD psychiatrist named Dr. Stanislav Groff. So Groff is a huge pioneer in LSD, in using LSD in a psychotherapeutic way. He did, he was involved in over 4,000 sessions from around late 1950s to through the 1970s. He's written about a dozen books and covered a lot of things. And I read one of his books, and it just showed me this image of psychedelics inducing these, fascinating experiences that often can overlap with the experiences I was reading about in what I was reading on Buddhism and Eastern spirituality. They seem to be able to let you enter these mystical states of unitive oneness and bliss, and allow you to escape your usual constrained egoic consciousness to something greater. And I was reading this at a time where I was like, oh, psychedelics are supposed to make you go crazy. They're like hard drugs. They're bad for you, which is what a lot of people are kind of told with a very poor drug education that's not evidence-based. And then so I was like, these are fascinating compounds that are understudied. They're stigmatized for no real good reason. And there's so much potential behind them. And I was just fascinated in their ability to help people, but also just as a way of understanding consciousness and the way our brain and mind construct our reality.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. So, one of the things that actually brought me to your work was really understanding the neuroscience of how psychedelics impact the mind. So I think a lot of us know the impacts of psychedelics on our, experience, spiritual and healing experience. Many psychedelic plants have been used for, millennia by indigenous peoples around the world. So, we have a long history of stories, of, traditions, of lineage, of anecdotal evidence all around the web on how people have attributed their profound healing experiences and complete transformation of their lives to become better people to psychedelics. And so, I think science is just finally starting to catch up with what the shamans might have known for, centuries. And I'm curious to know have the scientific findings, what do they tell us about how psychedelics work in the brain to even elicit these feelings?
Yeah, totally. And it's obviously there's a lot of detail here and there's a lot I can go into. But well, one, if we start from the basics on how they affect the brain. So at the end of the day, a psychedelic, let's say psilocybin, which is the compound in magic mushrooms, it's a particular chemical compound that goes into your brain and activates certain brain receptors. And through those brain receptors, it affects brain activity. And so we know that psychedelics, the main effects of psychedelics are related to a specific receptor in our brain, which these psychedelics latch onto. They literally latch onto them in their brain. And this is the so-called serotonin 2A receptor. And so usually, this receptor can be only activated by serotonin, and psychedelics act as if they're serotonin at this specific subtype of receptor and activate it. And somehow this leads to all the whole variety and diversity of experiences people could go under with psychedelics. What's interesting is that these receptors are most located in parts of our brain that are most interconnected. So you can say these are the parts of our brain that have the most influence on the entire brain as a whole. And basically, to simplify things, we could say there are three major components to how they affect the brain, perhaps. One is that by activating these very interconnected regions, all of a sudden the whole brain becomes more interconnected. So if you think about it, these regions have connections to a lot of places, and if these regions become more active, all these connections are starting to become active. That's why you see these images online of like, here's your brain normally, and here's it is on psychedelics, and there's so many more connections on the psychedelic side. It's because activating these regions, which are highly interconnected. And so you could say psychedelics make our brain more interconnected. And then not only that, when your brain is more interconnected, it now has more possibilities of states it can enter into. And I hope I'm not losing people, but you can imagine if something has many different connections, there's many different possible configurations of those connections that can exist. I hope that makes sense and it's not too abstract. And so basically the brain is able to be more free, and it's able to enter into all sorts of states it's not usually able to enter into. You're able to explore states of consciousness which deviate from our normal consciousness, and have this kind of diversity and richness of experience that we don't usually have, which is related to a kind of diversity in our brain activity. And then those two, combined with the fact that psychedelics seem to boost neuroplasticity, if you put that all together, it's like it puts the brain in this state where it's very flexible. There's so many more new possible connections you can go into. And it also makes the brain more plastic. So now we could create new patterns and have them last. And so it kind of shakes up our brain and our usual way of operating to let us enter into a different variety of ways of perceiving the world and yourself, and then gives you the resources to encode that in a lasting way for behavioral change.
It's kind of interesting that those fMRI brain scans that came out where it was like, this is a normal brain, and then this is your brain on drugs, which is kind of like much more, it was much more colorful. There were many more connections. It's a complete contrast to the commercials, back in the day where it was like, frying, some eggs in a frying pan, like this is your brain on drugs, and it's like all fried and burnt and all of that. So it's, what I like to, I think it's a much more positive visual image, which is, that of a brain that's kind of, more connected, more, utilizing other parts of this organ that aren't typically activated. So, I guess the question is like, how do we necessarily know if this is a good thing? I mean, on one hand, it's like, we could potentially be accessing more creativity and more ways of knowing, but at the same time, what if, can that trigger, some negative aspects too? Like, is it a good thing to expand our neural networks in such a way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, at the end of the day, it's important to note that psychedelics in some sense are value neutral. Like they don't guarantee a positive experience. And this is why set and setting is so important. And we could talk about what that means. It means in brief, it means that just setting up your internal mental environment and your external social and physical environment in such of a way that's conducive to a positive experience. And so psychedelics in and of themselves are not positive per se. And one way of understanding, kind of to relate what I said before, if your brain's in this very flexible, interconnected state, it's also very kind of sensitive, very sensitive to what's happening around you, because it's able to just go into a particular state much more easily. And so if you're in a very negative place, or like let's say you go to a music festival, you ate way too much shrooms, and now you're tripping in the corner and everything's getting dark and etc. It's because you put yourself in a very open, flexible state without the right support around you. So you can easily get destabilized and go into a more anxious headspace, which is a so-called bad trip. And so that's why it's so important when you take a psychedelic, especially a higher dose, to really be aware of where you're doing it, who you're doing it with, how you're feeling, because the sense of flexibility it gives you is kind of like a double-edged sword, right? It could take you into these blissful realms of unitive oneness, but it can take you into some of the deepest pits of anxiety and fear you've ever experienced as well. And what we know from the studies that they've conducted is very, very little people who experience severe anxiety or fear. It's overwhelmingly positive, with lasting positive impacts on their behavior, on their outlook on life, on their well-being. And this is because the research studies are done in very controlled environments. There's a lot of preparation beforehand, a particular type of support within the experience, and then follow-ups as well. So this is why the overall container is so essential to ensuring that you use this flexibility and plasticity that psychedelics give you in the right way or in a correct way.
So do all psychedelics function in this way, or are we only talking about the classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's most pertinent for those three you mentioned, so LSD, psilocybin, mescaline. But interestingly enough, the shorter acting psychedelics like DMT, and then there's 5-MeO, DMT, it seemed to be a bit more independent of set and setting. Not totally independent, but there are things that cultivate a deeper experience and so on. But they seem to be less sensitive to that, and it comes down to how psychedelics work. I mean, for some reason, like DMT and 5-MeO DMT often involve an experience of going inside or of going away from your immediate external environment, and where you kind of might feel like you're entering into a new dimension of reality, or you might lose all sense of space and time and form altogether. And it kind of detaches you from what's going on around you. And whereas LSD and psilocybin at the normal doses do kind of the reverse sometimes. They make you hypersensitive to what's around you, unless your eyes are closed with eye shades, etc. But if you're in an open environment without headphones on or something like this, you're very sensitive to what's going around you. You're sensitive to people's vibes, to the weather, to the aesthetics of where you are. And this is because those drugs are longer lasting, and for some reason don't as easily take you away from what's going on around you. Yeah.
So have there been fMRI studies of, most of the psychedelics that are being used right now or explored in psychedelic medicine, or only, principally LSD and psilocybin? I mean, does, ayahuasca also have the same effect on your neural pathways? And have there been, studies on the fMRI readings of ayahuasca, for example?
There have, yeah. So there've been fMRI readings on LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, and DMT itself. And what's interesting, I mean, as I said before, all four of these drugs, I guess three, because DMT is an ayahuasca too, but there's other stuff too, but they primarily act at the same serotonin receptor. Therefore, you would expect that, to the extent that that receptor plays a dominant role, they'll all be similar in the brain. But of course, there's other receptors they also hit, and they're different across drugs, and it gets complex. But there is an overall similarity in how they affect the brain, as revealed by fMRI, because they all have a similar mechanism of action, which involves this particular receptor. So you do see greater interconnectivity and greater entropy, as they would call it, or like complexity of brain states and brain dynamics across all of those.
Yeah, so I'd love to explore, okay, so, I think one of the burning questions in the space is, okay, so we do know that the psychedelics impact the mind in a certain way, or impact the brain in a certain way, but how can we actually leverage those changes in an intentional way so that people can actually achieve their desired outcomes. So many people are going to psychedelics to, heal trauma, to heal, physical conditions like pain, to change the way that they're thinking, to be able to mind hack their self-talk, for example, or to be able to capture flow states, whatever that means. So I'd love to explore, what the research shows in terms of how we might be able to leverage psychedelic states intentionally. And if you could speak to, some of the theories that have come up, you'd mentioned entropy, and you'd also mentioned the default mode network. Can you help us understand what these mean and how they impact, how they influence psychedelics for healing and transformation?
Yeah, for sure. So I think a good place to start for this question is in terms of theories of how psychedelics work, kind of overarching theories. And one of the main ones, one of the leading ones that is pretty compelling and but it needs a lot more research is the so-called relaxed beliefs under psychedelics model proposed by Robin Carhart Harris. And the idea behind this model, and it's just very intuitive, is that when you're in a psychedelic state, in virtue of these effects on the brain, it makes your sense of certainty about your beliefs and your assumptions less rigid. It makes them more fluid, and you're all of a sudden not so certain about who you are or how the world works. And these kind of fundamental beliefs you took for granted, you start to question them, or they just don't seem correct anymore. And through that process, you become more open to receiving new information, new perspectives and insights, open to seeing the world in a different way. Because now you're escaped from this kind of conceptual prison we create for ourselves through our ego structures and defense mechanisms and kind of unconscious beliefs and all these things. So through its activity on the brain, it gives us this temporary respite from all these things. We're able to, see outside of the bubble that we're in a little bit. And that this gives you an opportunity to then take this new information you're now getting access to and use it to kind of create lasting change and to do that, you have to take these insights you're gaining and implement them into a daily practice or something you do on a regular basis. Because at the end of the day, you can go into the psychedelic experience, see things from a new perspective, have a beautiful experience, escape from your egoic consciousness for a bit and experience what it's like to be out of that. But if you don't make a conscious intention and make actionable steps afterwards, it'll just fade into a memory of a great experience you had, and you'll go back to being how you were before. Because anybody who's tried to change themselves realize how hard it is, and the brain is very stubborn. It doesn't want you to change. You fall back on habits. You can go extremely high and then come back down worse than you were before, and that's just how growth or development works. And it's the same with psychedelics. Like psychedelics, you can't take them as a panacea and then now you're fine, you're healed, your traumas are all gone. It's like they'll help you work through stuff and give you the insights and clarity that you can then use in your own life with a daily practice and consistent changes that you make. So I think the best way to perhaps view psychedelics is as giving you an opportunity to make change, and just an opportunity, but it's on you to do the work to make it actually last.
So there's a lot of conversation in the psychedelic space about the default mode network. Can you tell us what that is exactly and how psychedelics impacts the default mode network?
Yeah, for sure. So the default mode network is a set of brain regions in the brain, which kind of, you could say, interact with each other in support of shared functions. There are a set of regions which interact more with each other than they do with the rest of the brain. It's another way to say it. And so this collection of brain regions is active in all sorts of these very complex aspects of our thinking that almost define us as humans. So our ability to escape the present moment and think about the past or imagine the future, our ability to imagine or think about the beliefs and mental states of other people, our ability to identify things as being related to ourself or not. It helps us maintain this personal narrative of who we are, who we were, who we are now, and who we're going to be. It's involved when we interpret movies even, and read books and interpret narratives. It's involved in a whole variety of processes, which involve our, you could say, our memory and our concepts in order to contextualize and understand our experience. So the default mode network is a very complex network that's involved in a whole variety of things. And the way it's kind of being latched onto in the psychedelic landscape is in terms of supporting the ego. And now, you know, I think it's much more complicated than that. And it's not the only network that's involved in maintaining egoic consciousness, you could say. But based on what I just described, it's a likely candidate to be very important for it. And actually, what's interesting is the default mode network is one of the networks with the most amount of the serotonin 2A receptor. So I mentioned before, serotonin 2A receptor is on some of the most interconnected parts of the brain, which also happen to be the default mode network a lot of the time. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And so psychedelics do seem to be poised to uniquely affect the default mode network. And it might be the case that they affect the rest of the brain partially through their effects on the highly interconnected regions in the default mode network. Now to bring this back to experience, there are studies finding correlations between the extent to which the default mode network disintegrates and how much people experience ego dissolution type phenomena in their trip. But what's important to note is that this hasn't been found in all the studies. Some studies have just not found it, but it has been found with LSD and psilocybin, for example. And so there, you know, there is potentially a link between ego dissolution and the default mode network. But one thing I will say is that the concept of ego dissolution is not even, you know, defined in very clear terms all the time, and in the science and even elsewhere. And it's very likely a complex thing that's composed of a number of different aspects. And there's also the question of, you know, should we view ego dissolution as like a yes or no, you know, 0 or 1 phenomena, or is there like a whole gradation of different types of ego dissolution, different extents of ego dissolutions, which is probably more accurate. And there's, you know, it's kind of like almost saying mystical experience is one thing. It's like, no, there's a huge variety of experiences which are quote unquote mystical with different levels of depth, et cetera. And so, you know, having this little questionnaire with 10 measures of, you know, oh, did you feel like your ego was dissolving, and then correlating that with the brain, like it's totally, you know, we're in the infancy there. Yeah, exactly. So I would take the whole default mode network narrative with a grain of salt, but I think in the future, it very well might be important, but we need lots more research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for putting that into context, and listening to what you said. Like, how do you define ego dissolution? It just brought me back to a moment. It was a 2017 Psychedelic Science Conference in Oakland, and I was at a dinner table with 2 DMT experts, Merrill Ward and the late James Orrick, and they were arguing about whether cosmic consciousness was white or golden yellow. It was fascinating. I'm like, wow, okay. But moving right along. So in these conversations, there's also a lot of conversation about a lot of focus around the topic of the topic of entropy. So what exactly does entropy mean in psychedelic neuroscience?
Mm-hmm. So I kind of mentioned it before, and so entropy sounds like this very, you know, abstract technical concept, but what it really like refers to is unpredictability. So if something is very entropic, if you were to look at it now, it's very hard to predict what it'll be in 5 seconds or 10 seconds or 5 minutes. And you could say, you know, usually our brain, because entropy is usually, you know, used to refer to brain activity, usually our brain is, you know, not totally predictable, obviously, but there's some predictability in it. There's a lot of regularity in how the activity moves over time. You know, if you see somebody's brain activity at time 1, at time 5, there's like some correlation most of the time, unless there's something crazy that happened in their moment. But if they're sitting there with their eyes closed, you can predict actually to some degree. But with psychedelics, that predictability is majorly gone. And now the brain is acting in all sorts of ways that are kind of unpredictable. Like it can, and this is a testament to it entering a more greater number of states. So if you think about it, if the brain, let's say, like toy example, brain can only enter into 5 states, there's already like a 20% chance at any time it's going to be in a given state. and you could predict based on it, some probability. But if it's now entering 15 different states, now it's much more difficult to predict what's going to be in the next moment. So in the psychedelics, it seems to be putting us in this greater range of different states, so it's more unpredictable. And this might be mirrored on the subjective side by the range of experiences we go through under a psychedelic, where often you'll be maybe 3 hours of a psychedelic trip and you feel like you just had a week's worth of information or experiences, which is a very common thing. And so entropy, represents greater diversity or complexity of brain dynamics over time and greater unpredictability. And also something that Robin Carhart-Harris has often linked it to, who's a leading psychedelic researcher, is the richness of experience. And you could see this kind of makes sense. If you're only entering 5 states in your entire life, that's not a very rich experience. You can only be in 1 of 5 places. But if you're now entering 15, 20 different states, your experience is more rich. There's more things you're experiencing. So you can see that psychedelics, by increasing entropy, are actually also increasing the richness of our experience as well.
Was it Robin Carhart-Harris that also proposed the Rebus model? What exactly is that? Can you share with us what the acronym actually means and what this has to do with psychedelics?
Yep, totally. Well, I described it before, right? So it's Rebus, stands for Relaxed Beliefs Under Psychedelics. And it's basically, I'll break it down based on the title, Relaxed Beliefs. So as I was saying before, it's the idea that psychedelics put us in a state where our assumptions and beliefs and models about how the world works, about who we are relaxed. They're made less strong, less rigid. So let's say, in a therapeutic context, you've internalized a belief from childhood that, you don't deserve happiness and success. You somehow learned that unconsciously. You could say that's a model or assumption or belief you have. Then in the psychedelic experience, you might be, awoken to the idea that maybe that's not true. This is a very common thing that people report. And the idea is that's because the psychedelics are kind of, by making the brain more entropic, to bring it back to that, is it's kind of like shaking up our usual models. It's like shaking up the standard ways, the standard states we're going into to interpret our reality. That's one way to say it. And so it kind of shakes up our rigidity in our thinking and our assumptions and our models, such that afterwards we could change them and be more open to information sources we had previously been ignoring. So that's, in general, the Rebus model. There's a lot more in terms of the brain and other stuff, but that's the general essence of it, I think.
So you had mentioned, when you have the psychedelic experience and all these mechanisms are active in the brain that allow us to kind of think outside the box and dissolve not only our sense of self and our rigidly held belief and about ourselves and the world. After that is over, right? Then what ends up happening is we have a couple choices. We can either do something about it and integrate the psychedelic experience, or we can choose to go on with our lives and not really spend a lot of time in integration, in which case we look back at the psychedelic experience as, wow, that was an amazing experience I had, and it kind of fades into memory. So then, moving towards the intentionality aspect, it's like, okay, let's work with psychedelics in a way to lock in lasting change and to, let's say, reframe that narrative that you might have adopted as a child, that belief that you didn't deserve happiness or success, and, really kind of like change it so that you believe the complete opposite, like you're fundamentally worthy and deserving of happiness and success. How can we use the integration period, and what practices would you suggest that would allow for us to be able to take advantage of that neural flexibility that is present in the afterglow stage and actually begin to lock in lasting change?
Yeah, totally. I think, well, the most important piece is consistency, because, let's say your brain now has discovered these new patterns that it can go into to experience the world in a better way. Let's just say that. And then if you want those patterns to be maintained over time, you have to be activating those patterns on a consistent basis. And so that comes down to consistency of holding on to the insights you had and finding a way to stabilize it and bring it and pull it back down into your everyday life. This can be, being catching yourself going into habitual ways of thinking and bringing yourself back. It could be catching yourself doing impulsively reacting and remembering like, oh, I don't need to be like that anymore, and settling yourself. So in this way, it's like, it's, I think, essential for integration to maintain a sense of clarity and stillness within yourself. I would say meditation is essential, yoga is essential, even going for walks in nature, making space for your mind not to be consumed by things, by work, by stimulation, and it's letting it, kind of calm, have the waters calm a little bit. Because when your mind is more calm, then you're less likely to automatically go into impulsive reactions. You're less likely to ruminate and go into and lose awareness of what your mind is doing. So I think the more you can maintain a sense of clarity and stillness within yourself and make space in your life for time of doing little to nothing, that will help you create the consistency in your behaviors, which will then help it last to a greater degree. So in this sense, it's really about taking actionable, specific things you're going to do on a day-to-day basis after your experience, and then following through and doing that, and then also doing practices to support you in maintaining that.
Do we have any scientific research about that substantiates the value of integration practices versus people who don't spend much time in integration?
Right, it's interesting. No, not really. There's not that much work on integration yet, because it's a very messy thing. Because integration is like, what is integration exactly? Integration is the rest of life in a sense. And there's a huge variety of ways we can say we're doing integration, but there hasn't been controlled studies necessarily on what that would look like on a long-term basis. But we do see, with psychedelic trials for mental health conditions, some people stay better for 6 months, a year. Some people relapse after 3 months, and it's like across the board, right? The majority of people seem to have sustained benefits, but there are many who don't. And that could be related to a whole variety of things, but it could very well be strongly related to a lack of proper integration and lack of community support. I think social support and community support, I didn't mention that, but those are essential. If you're coming back into a family or like an environment that devalues your experience and thinks you just went and did a drug, you're like, oh, how are you trying to get better by doing more drugs or something like this? That's not going to help you. But if you come back and you have a supportive group of friends or somebody you can talk about who understands it, that's going to make a huge difference. But yeah, as I said before, there's very little research actually on that yet.
Are there any long-term studies of groups of people that have been using psychedelics intentionally to be able to feel better, to heal, to transform themselves, to accomplish certain intentional goals? What are we working with really?
Yeah, so there are some, and they're called observational studies. So they're where researchers will go to an ayahuasca retreat center and kind of have people fill out questionnaires before and after their experience and this kind of stuff. And actually, these studies have suggested that being in a group context and having that support in the retreat setting is correlated with more positive outcomes. So there does seem to be observational research in the real world, which suggests the importance of these community and social contexts for these things in support of interpreting and integrating new experience.
Are there any long-term observational studies, or are they usually pretty short-term?
Usually pretty short-term. Not that I've seen. I haven't seen a long-term observational study, to be honest.
And what would be long-term versus, long-term, I would imagine like, years, but, what is the typical duration of a observational study?
Honestly, it's usually just before the experience and maybe, immediately after, and then something like a month or two after. That's usually what they would be. But I would say long-term is, minimum 6 months to a year out, but those haven't been really done in the observational context or even in most clinical trials either. It's usually the maximum 6 months, something like this so far. And again, we're in the really early stages with a lot of this research. People don't realize how much we don't know and how little research has been done so far.
So what are the most promising applications then that the scientists are starting to uncover?
Promising applications of psychedelics? I think
yes.
it is largely, therapy, healing, overcoming mental health conditions, depression. Sorry?
So, mental health conditions such as depression.
Yeah, such as depression, OCD, alcoholism, tobacco addiction. There's studies going on for anorexia, chronic pain, all of this stuff, and does seem to be a lot of potential there. And that's one side. And then the other side of it is like in healthy people, helping people connect with their meditation practice or their spirituality or something greater than themselves, or to deepen their sense of meaning and significance in their life. And there is some research on that coming out these days as well, especially from Johns Hopkins University, doing a lot of stuff around spiritual practice and meditation and this kind of stuff. And so there do seem to be, two major areas. And then there's a whole other area that is very unexplored, is like psychedelic effects on creativity and various other things, which I think will grow in the coming years.
So when it comes to depression, are psychedelics across the board effective in alleviating depression, especially among people who might be treatment resistant, or are certain psychedelics more effective than others?
Yeah, we don't know yet. So far, psilocybin has been used the most because, one, it doesn't have the cultural baggage of LSD. Two, it's much shorter than LSD. Three, it's a natural compound, so it's easier to make people okay with taking it because it comes from a mushroom. But there hasn't been any comparative studies between psychedelics for a particular outcome.
Does MDMA also have a similar effect in the neural pathways?
No, it's actually quite different. So basically, psilocybin, LSD, DMT, mescaline to some extent too, activate the serotonin 2A receptor that I've talked about, whereas MDMA actually increases the release, we could just say that increases the release of three different neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, and noradrenaline, also called norepinephrine. So it's very different in that these classic psychedelics act as if they're serotonin and primarily activate the specific receptor, whereas MDMA releases these natural neurotransmitters, which affect a whole variety of receptors, including the 2A, but it's like kind of just one of many. It's hitting a lot of things because it's just increasing these neurotransmitters in general. So actually, MDMA is very different in its mechanism of action from the other psychedelics, and to the extent that people often don't call it a psychedelic. I personally wouldn't refer to MDMA as a psychedelic. It's more of a entactogen is what people call it, or empathogen.
Yeah, I've heard empathogen used frequently as well. Yeah, I would say the effect is quite different compared to some of the classic psychedelics. Powerful in a different way. And I can see how it would be a really powerful medicine to be used for the alleviation of trauma and PTSD, certainly in a way that might be, easier and less triggering than, ayahuasca. I think, some people do find a tremendous relief from PTSD and trauma, through ayahuasca journeys, but it can just as easily also bring a person back to that traumatic event in a way that might, then elicit much more need for support and for, for psychotherapy, especially when it comes to some of the challenges that the veterans might be seeking to overcome.
Yeah, it's definitely to be very careful. These things, it's like you're not dealing with light stuff in these contexts, right? PTSD is a very difficult and difficult to treat, difficult to go through. So you have to be very careful when you're in context where this stuff is going to come up. So MDMA does seem to be somewhat safer in that sense, but there is research ongoing for psilocybin, at least, maybe ayahuasca too, for PTSD. So that is a thing as well.
So what is going on with the use of psychedelics and addiction therapy? For many people that are outside of the psychedelic world, it might seem a bit, quite a contradiction that you would use a drug to help people become, heal their addiction to other drugs. Do we know about the mechanisms in the brain that allow certain psychedelics to be effective in addiction therapy? So I was surprised to learn that LSD was being used for alcoholism. And then, of course, we've got positive indications that, iboga and ibogaine, as well as 5-MeO-DMT can be effective in cutting addiction cravings to opioids. So I'd love to hear what you might know about addiction recovery and psychedelics.
Yeah, totally. It's a really interesting topic. And LSD and alcoholism has a long precedent. There were dozens of studies in the 50s and 60s on that. And Bill Wilson, who started Alcoholics Anonymous, had kind of LSD was an essential part of his ability to go off to overcome his alcoholism. And actually, he was trying to make LSD as the cornerstone of AA, but his board didn't like it because exactly what you said. It's like, oh, you're gonna use a drug to get over the drug. And as you know, maybe you know this in AA, a connection to a greater power is an essential part of it, a way of people overcoming it. And so Bill Wilson recognized way back when, in the early stages that LSD is a unique way of facilitating that experience of a connection to something greater that helps people kind of get over their need for alcohol in a sense. And this way, it's really interesting to think about how psychedelics can help with addiction. And I think it's important to recognize that psychedelics don't necessarily put an experience into you that wasn't already there. They catalyze our unconscious, they catalyze our internal experiences, and they're just kind of the stimulator or amplifier of what's already there. They're not taking something external and putting it into you necessarily. And so it's not really a drug in that it's kind of, altering your experience in accordance with just it. It's just guiding you to certain aspects of yourself. And the way it helps people, psilocybin's being used for tobacco addiction too, with really promising results, and alcoholism, and LSD for alcoholism. And there's stuff around opiates and stuff on the way as well. And the reason being, you have to go back to one of the reasons why people might be addicted in the first place. And if you're familiar with Gabor Mate's work, or a variety of people, I guess, is that people are trying to fill a void they feel within themselves. They feel incomplete. They feel like they're missing something. And this could be as a result of trauma. It could be a result of the culture they internalized. But they feel like they're essentially incomplete and they have an emptiness inside of them that the drug will fill. And so it's kind of a defense mechanism or a self-medication mechanism at the beginning, which turns into a very strong habit because it messes with your reward system in your brain and all that. And so if you bring it back to people are addicted because they feel empty inside and they need it to feel whole, you give them a psychedelic, which maybe puts them in this unitive, blissful spiritual experience where they recognize, what it's like to be fully whole within yourself and to feel the sense of self-love that they didn't feel, and also see the magnitude of a consciousness that's accessible to them. They're like, why the hell am I smoking? Like, what is this for? And they really just see the ridiculousness of this, of their addiction, and are able to just see so far beyond it that they're, able to make changes in their life where it just doesn't fit in anymore. And this is specifically what they've reported in the clinical trials, actually.
Yeah, I recently saw the documentary with Gabor Mate called "The Wisdom of Trauma," and I thought that was a really beautiful and powerful, way to humanize the stories of many of the addicts that he worked with. So, I think one of the tragedies of our time is that there are so many deaths of despair that are happening, and when you actually inquire into, why are people becoming addicted to opioids? I mean, there was the conspiracy by the Sackler family and the intentional distribution of OxyContin, which got huge numbers of people addicted to an opioid-based pain medication. And at the same time, we also have large swaths of the United States, for example, where people have no economic prospects and their lives are so hard and miserable and without hope that of course they're just going to try to medicate themselves to feel differently than the harsh reality of their lives. So I think it's so important right now when we look at drug addiction to really, come from it from a place of compassion. And that compassion really starts with, being more trauma informed, that understanding that, if people had the the support that they needed to thrive as children growing up and to thrive as adults. Like most people wouldn't choose to be addicted and to do the things that got them into addictions. Like if they had if society supported them, if they had housing, if they had positive upbringing, they had no worry about where money was going to come from. I mean, it's such a bigger societal issue. And I think that the fact that psychedelic medicine is now becoming there's so much more interest. It's a really it's a really momentous time, I think, and potentially a turning point in our global health crisis. I am curious to know from a neuroscientific perspective, though, I know a lot of folks that are not in this world, would say, well, aren't you just replacing one addiction for another? Do you know anything about why psychedelics are not physically addictive?
Well, they don't directly activate our reward system in the brain. And so, the reason why cocaine or heroin or opiates and other things are addictive is because they give you a sense of reward, of pleasure, in a consistent basis. And, in the case of opiates, actually, it's more so it's a relief from pain, and that could be itself addictive. And cocaine and stuff, it hijacks your system, which tells you that things are good. And tells you like, oh, this is really good, I should keep getting it. And then you do it enough times and your brain is, your brain tells you that you need it. And you could see how that you need that to function. You need your brain to be able to tell you what things are good and you should do again and things that are bad you shouldn't do again. What these drugs can often do is directly activate and hijack that system, telling you, oh, this is so good, it's the best thing I've ever had. And then the brain's like, oh, this must be really good for my survival. I must really need this if it's this good. And then it just tells you like, oh, seek it out, seek it out, seek it out. But psychedelics, again, primarily activate the serotonin system through the 2A receptor and have very little effects on the dopamine system. And so the reward system is very intimately linked to the dopamine neurotransmitter. And psychedelics don't reliably affect dopamine in the reward system. And in virtue of that, they can't be nearly as addictive as the other compounds. And also, if you just have a psychedelic experience, it's not like you're not going to want to do that every day. It's often difficult, intense, draining, and exhausting. And so it doesn't lend itself necessarily to the same kind of psychological dependence either. And also, there's rat studies, for example, where, the classic study where you study whether something's addictive is do rats continuously self-administer it when they have an opportunity. It's like if you put them in a cage and make it available, will they keep on drinking it? Cocaine, they'll keep doing it, they'll ignore their food, they'll die from doing it. Psilocybin or LSD, they actually avoid it. They'll try it a couple of times, they're like, oh, that was weird, I don't want to do that anymore. That also suggests it's at a very basic biological level, it's not addictive.
Okay, so we were talking a lot about macrodosing and the ways in which full adult, journey-based dosages can elicit healing and transformational experiences. Now, what do we know about the efficacy and usefulness of microdosing, that is taking small sub-perceptual amounts of the same psychedelics towards the same intended outcomes?
Yeah, people might not be happy about it, but a lot of the research is showing that it might just be placebo. That's today.
Oh no, it's not. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah. But anyway, this is what's coming out in the research, and a lot of people share your view, of course. That's why I said that. But a lot of the studies have found that either there's little to no difference, or people think they got better in a particular way, but all the tasks and measures say they got better in a different way. There was one large-scale study using a so-called citizen science approach, and we could talk about that if you want, but it was the largest placebo-controlled study, and they found that microdosing improved mood and improved attention and improved all these things, but so did the placebo, and there was a significant difference between them. So whether they took the sugar pill or the microdose capsule, they reported improvements regardless. And they did a whole bunch of other analyses as well, all showing that, yeah, it was just expectation effects. It was just people thought they would get better, and so they did to some extent. And so, based on the scientific evidence, most researchers are on the side of viewing microdosing as predominantly placebo. And that's just, the current nature of the literature.
That's fascinating, though, because surely, I mean, there's a very different, I mean, okay, it's subperceptual, but you still, I mean, if you calibrate your dosage correctly, you can still feel a distinct difference than, your ordinary waking state, versus the psilocybin enhanced state, for example. So I'm genuinely intrigued by how they came. Well, okay, I mean, maybe it is just very difficult to control, to design and implement a controlled study, because it's just, the effects are so much more subtle. But I would say that, depending on what substance you're working with, there can be a very distinct feeling between a microdose of LSD and your normal everyday life.
Yeah, definitely. So what the research, I mean, the research isn't denying that there was a subjective experience associated with microdosing in certain cases, but what it's saying is that, sure, you might feel different, you might feel these subtle changes, but it's not translating to improvements in these specific tasks that we're giving people, or measures that we're giving people. That's kind of the idea, is that, sure, it affects your consciousness, but it's not improving these things in a reliable and consistent way that a lot of people think they are. But I should say, I mean, it could very well just because the measures we're using aren't suited to capturing what microdosing is doing. It might be too subtle. We might need larger studies that are designed in different ways. So really, we don't know for sure. I'm just saying that to date, that the evidence so far, which is relatively limited, as in all places in psychedelic science, suggests it's only placebo. But we don't know for sure. We don't know necessarily if it's better, for people who are suffering from something, depression or anxiety or OCD, whether they might experience benefits that are greater than placebo. It's unclear whether that's the case. So there's a lot more research that needs to be done, and that is ongoing.
Have there been any fMRI studies of people's brains on microdoses?
Only one. No, I think only one with ayahuasca, actually, interestingly enough.
Oh, interesting.
And they did find some changes. I can't remember what exactly they were at this point, but there were some changes. But I think they called it a microdose, but it was definitely greater than you would expect for a microdose. But I'm not that familiar with that study, actually. But they did. It was one study done by a lab in Brazil, I believe, and they did find some changes to the brain fMRI.
Okay. Well, cool. So, we're coming close to our QA section. I just, want to, ask maybe a couple more questions before we turn it over to the audience. So let's see. Now, given these developments in psychedelic science, where do you think we're going with all of this? Like a DMT nasal spray? That's over.
Right. There's already DMT vapes. Those are a thing, right? People vape DMT, like small doses. So,
but
the
microdose DMT vapes.
Yeah, they exist. They're popular. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a Vice article on it, even, I think.
But
Vice or some other outlet.
But are they available by prescription yet, or
no, not legally, but in the gray market of the internet.
Yeah, there's any number of products that are available illegally, but right. I'm hoping that at some point we're going to get to a point where we can actually go and get it prescribed, or go to the pharmacy and get this. So I mean, where are we going with all of this?
So I think in terms of accessibility, it'll be in the context of clinics, of perhaps dedicated psychedelic clinics, where you will go there. They'll have trip rooms, and they'll have trained facilitators, and you could be prescribed by a psychiatrist, or perhaps probably has to be somebody with an MD, so a psychiatrist or doctor, to be able to take it in that controlled context. So I think that's going to be the model, at least in the beginning. People are not going to be given psychedelics to take home and do as by themselves, at least at the beginning. It's going to be in particular treatment centers. And people are projecting, 3 years, 2-3 years. There's already initiatives in Oregon and places in California to enable this, to have psychedelic therapy centers, and for people to go and do it legally, even before it's approved by the FDA and everything. So that's also potentially going to happen in the next couple of years. And so I think that's going to be the model of psychedelic clinics. Maybe you can go there, they'll have LSD, psilocybin, ketamine available, and they'll give you your diagnosis. They'll test you in a variety of ways and say like, you can, maybe benefit from psilocybin, and then this, maybe holistic intervention combined with it or something like that. I think that would be the ideal. And there are companies with such a clinic model in the works, just waiting for things to become regulated and legal and available. So I think that's, in terms of accessibility for the everyday person, I think that's what it's going to look like.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, this whole clinical model. Like, do you want to actually trip in a clinic? So I had the good fortune of receiving an underground intramuscular dose of ketamine. And it was really quite nice to be in my friend's living room on their very comfortable bed, having this journey, and then, being able to talk to them as I was coming out of it. And then, I'd never actually experienced ketamine in a clinic. I had actually at one point wanted to, because the pandemic was really, wearing on my mental health. And I was like, at a certain point, I was like, I think I need ketamine. And so then I, emailed a ketamine clinic and got this big intake form. I'm like, oh my God, I got to fill this out. And then, and then I ended up just connecting with so many, friends during this particular journey, this trip in the United States, that like literally I just didn't feel like I needed any. And so, so it was interesting, because then when I was informed what the ketamine clinic experience was like, it felt really quite sterile. It's like, okay, you go to a clinic, you're in the waiting room, and then you go and get your ketamine infusion. And then you come out of it, and then you sit in the waiting room for a little bit, and then you get in an Uber and you go home. But during that time, you're in this session room, and you're having you could have the most transcendent oneness experience. And I don't know if the practitioner's in the room with you, talking to you, or maybe you're by yourself, or, and it feels so isolating. I wonder, would there ever be an environment where, people could actually be experiencing psychedelic therapies, but in a legal, community-based type of environment?
I think definitely that's the ideal future. The way that ketamine is being done is garbage. It's terrible. It's as you said, it's like you go into this clinic, you're like, okay, we'll inject you with ketamine. You might have some weird stuff happen to you, but don't worry, it'll end soon. And then you can go home, totally devaluing the subjective experience. And that's the medical approach. I actually have a good friend. He runs a ketamine clinic here in Montreal, and he's all about incorporating the psychotherapeutic aspect to it of, okay, so what actually came up in your experience? How does that relate to your life, and et cetera?
Yeah.
And that's how it should, be done. But it's like the medical model is often scared of subjective experiences. They just want drugs. You take them, it does something in your brain, and you feel better. That's the SSRI, the antidepressant, all these, drugs. The fact that there can be a drug that combines a drug action with an experience-based psychotherapy component is kind of like a new thing for psychiatry, which is kind of crazy. And so, yeah, often it is devalued, but there is more research coming out, kind of trying to argue for the importance of acknowledging the experience and creating container and, and proper integration in the context of ketamine. And some clinics do that. Not all clinics are, like you described. Luckily they're not all like that, but the majority are like that, which is unfortunate. But I think with psilocybin and LSD, just by the very nature of their experience, like stuff like that wouldn't happen. Just because the research base is very different. The approaches in the clinical trials are very different. So it will be in much more, you come into a very comfortable looking space. It'll be very pleasing. People will be supporting you during the experience, and then after, you'll have all sorts of things. So that's the kind of clinic I'm envisioning for these drugs.
Yeah, I would love to see something that feels, more communal, because I mean, it's like, that is the fundamental tragedy, I think, of our modern industrialized society, which is what's driving a lot of people to, feel depressed or to seek out other forms of self-medication, is this feeling of self-isolation. So why recreate that, with something that gives you the experience of oneness?
I know. Mm-hmm.
Another aspect of the coming decriminalization, legalization that I'm curious about too is, what I'm seeing in California, in the United States, is, especially in California, is that it almost feels like we are legalization of cannabis era, where literally I'm seeing like all these microdosing products getting developed with very professional packaging. And I'm seriously wondering, like, will this ever actually be sold at Whole Foods, or are you actually going to still need to get a prescription for this product? Because technically, okay, sure, if you take the recommended dosage, whether it's 1 capsule or 2 capsules, you're not going to feel much. It's a threshold, but then you're going to run into the same issue with, as we've seen with like the legal weed market, which is you need to now just implement safety measures to make sure that you don't have children or teens taking the entire bottle of 90 capsules in one go. So do you actually envision the psilocybin microdoses becoming, somewhat available in a dispensary model, or even, in a health food store?
I think it's possible, not in the near future, maybe in the longer term. But as you said, there's a huge gray market for it. In California, I'm from Vancouver. There's like so many dispensaries that sell magic mushrooms as if it was cannabis. It was like, it's very similar to that. And then, which is also promising because it's suggesting it's likely going down that route. But I think with psilocybin, I think the main concern with microdosing is that people will take more than they should. But this is often why niacin is an ingredient in these ones, where niacin makes you flush. It's very uncomfortable if you take too much. And I think putting in compounds that are just not very pleasant into it as well, but that would only not be pleasant if you take, 3 or 4 more of these capsules. I think that would be what happens. It won't be just pure psilocybin.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you put niacin in the psilocybin capsules, then you take the whole thing, then all of a sudden you're having a trip and you're having a really bad niacin flush, which now has like locked you into a bad niacin trip.
Yeah, I mean, this is where drug education comes in, right? Because really you can just you can down your whole bottle of Benadryl if you wanted to, right? And have some crazy dissociative experience, or, so and there's risk associated with every drug. So I think there's proper education of like, yeah, you're not going to feel good if you eat this bottle. Like, you're not going to go down your Tylenol. So, kind of framing it in proper education and just treating it in similar standing to other drugs, I think would be the way.
Got it. Okay. What are you currently working on right now?
So I'm working on a few projects on a psychedelic front. I have access to fMRI data on psilocybin, DMT, and LSD. And I'm doing some of the first ever actually analyses, putting them all side by side and looking at what's consistent across them, in a more formal, quantitative way. So I'm doing some stuff on that, just applying different measures and seeing how they're similar across drugs. That's one thing I'm doing. And a number of other smaller projects too.
How exciting. Well, I'm looking forward to when your research comes out about that. I'm sure, inquiring minds want to know. So thank you so much for doing that. We're going to head over to questions now. So do you have any other concluding thoughts on how we might be able to use psychedelics to improve our lives before we head off to the QA panels?
Yeah, I think the most important thing was 2 things, I guess. One is do them safely with the right preparation, know what you're giving yourself into, the standard spiel I'm sure everyone has heard. The other one is like, don't expect them to just heal you. Ideally, how I see psychedelics is one component of a broader set of holistic interventions and changes you make in your life. You're not just going to go to an ayahuasca retreat and be cured of everything. There's a lot of work you need to do before and after to really make the most of it. And so, I would suggest that people see it that way and see these compounds as like stimulators of your process. They'll help catalyze experiences that help you dissolve traumas and have insights in a faster rate. but it still requires some very hard work often from you. So don't get lazy and think psychedelics are going to do the job for you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your words of advice. So we're going to hop over to some questions. One of the questions coming from the QA box is, what do you think about administering psychedelics, specifically psilocybin, to those suffering from bipolar?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Like bipolar, on all the studies, if you have any inkling of bipolar disorder, you can't join the study. The reason being, these people are often very difficult to work with. Like any psychiatrist, some of the most problematic and difficult, who to work with, to get along with, to build rapport with, etc. So it's a very delicate situation to try to treat somebody with bipolar disorder with a psychedelic, where their tendencies can be amplified, and all of a sudden they can be very distrustful of the therapist, want to leave the room, and act in ways that are quite intense, just given their disorder. And so it's really something that's not being approached right now. But there was actually a paper by a guy I know, I've been linked to him. His name's Richard Zeifman. And I believe he wrote a paper on making the case that psychedelics can help with bipolar disorder, among other things, because they help, if done in the right way, in the right context, with better emotional regulation and awareness of your emotions and kind of disentangling from your emotions. And also help you to kind of step back from your sense of self, and you're kind of allowing you to see things from a different perspective instead of being consumed by whatever you're thinking at that moment. So there is potential there, but I think that's a long ways off because it's quite risky to try.
Got it. Another question from Hapa. How can psychedelics help elderly folks who are losing their memory and focus? Now, I have heard that there have been studies that have documented the neuroplasticity of psychedelics like psilocybin and ayahuasca. So what do we know about how psychedelics can improve cognitive function, especially in mental decline?
Yeah, definitely. So there are studies ongoing for using psilocybin for Alzheimer's patients to help them with exactly that. The idea being that, it helps with neuroplasticity. We actually didn't really talk about neuroplasticity today, but, one of the things that happen as you get older is, or like the correlate of Alzheimer's is your brain cells are trying to die basically and not be as efficient in how they activate and all these kinds of things. And, things like psilocybin, potently increase neuroplasticity, at least in animal models, but presumably in humans too. And that this can help the brain regenerate some neurons and maintain them in a healthy way for a longer period of time. And so perhaps, let's say you have someone with Alzheimer's and you're trying to help them by giving them this cognitive task that they have to do every day to keep their mind active. But if you do that with psilocybin, it might even be more beneficial, because now you're getting an extra neuroplasticity to maintain those changes and maintain optimal brain health. So it's very possible. And they're actually, scientists, chemists are trying to devise compounds which are similar to psychedelics, which increase neuroplasticity, maybe hit the 2A receptor, but don't make you trip. And it is possible through some different intracellular changes they can elicit. And that might be good for old people who don't necessarily want to trip, but they want to get the neuroplastic benefits. And so there are a number of research teams looking at that.
But could the neuroplastic benefits be elicited if you're doing microdosing, and then you're not experiencing the full trip, but you're, just kind of taking your microdose supplements, one day on, 2 days off for an extended period of time?
Yeah. There's preliminary evidence saying yes, there probably does. There's evidence with LSD that a low dose increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is protein involved in neuroplasticity. So there does seem to be some neuroplastic benefit from taking microdoses, but the extent to which that happens compared to macrodoses and what the different effects are behaviorally is just like an open question. So we don't really know, but it could be the case that a particular microdosing regimen of 200 milligrams, of dried mushroom on a certain basis with lion's mane or like the Paul Stamets stack or something could be really helpful. But we need, there's research ongoing, but not published yet on that.
So there's a lot of argumentation around whether or not there are any risks to microdosing, and especially if there are any long-term risks. What do we know scientifically about long-term toxicity and microdosing?
Yeah, I mean, all the research suggests that psychedelics, at least you could say psilocybin, LSD, DMT, mescaline, are among the least neurotoxic of drugs, even on the order of Tylenol or Advil. And so there's no evidence linking long-term microdosing to any neurotoxic effects or negative effects on the brain. The only one thing that people sometimes raise is the fact that it hits the so-called serotonin 2B receptor, which is actually located in your heart and regulates aspects of your heartbeat. So the theory is that in principle, if you're activating that receptor too much, it might lead to irregular heartbeat and perhaps cardiotoxicity, is what it would be called. But at the same time, certain neuropharmacologists, people who study these things, have done computational modeling based on how much it would actually activate the receptor reasonably, and they've suggested that no, this is very unlikely. And tons of people have been microdosing for years. You don't get people having heart attacks from microdosing. Just if you think about if 100,000 people, let's say across the entire world, has used it on a semi-regular basis for the last 5 years, or at some period in the last 5 years, nobody's reporting heart deficits, then probably it's in principle possible, but very unlikely in practice. So this is all to say there's no research suggesting a negative physiological effect of taking microdosing, taking microdoses.
Well, that's a relief. Cool. So is ketamine one of the classic psychedelics, or is that a different category? Because I have a couple questions coming through about ketamine and how that influences the body and, your brain.
For sure. So ketamine is very different than MDMA and classic psychedelics. As I mentioned, classical psychedelics act on the serotonin 2A. MDMA affects these 3 different neurotransmitters. Ketamine acts directly on what's called your glutamate system, which is a different neurotransmitter system in your brain that mediates increased activity. It's actually the most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain. How do I say this without too much detail? But what's interesting is that classic psychedelics, they affect the serotonin 2A, but a downstream consequence of activating the 2A is increasing glutamate. So in the end, it's affecting a similar set of brain cells in a similar way than ketamine, which does it directly. So there is some overlap in the end result of serotonin 2A activation by classic psychedelics and the mechanism of ketamine. So there is some similarity, and this relates to neuroplasticity because glutamate is very involved in neuroplasticity and learning. And so ketamine potently boosts neuroplasticity through glutamate. And there's evidence that psychedelics partially also induce neuroplasticity through glutamate mechanisms. So there is some overlap, but overall the experiences are very different. Just in general, the pharmacology is quite different, even though there's overlap, and the experiences are different, and the framework in which they're given is very different.
Got it. Okay. Let's see. What is the approach with psychedelics if you are dealing with a prospective patient who's on Western psychiatric meds? So if a person's on Western psychiatric meds, would you even recommend that they use psychedelics for their condition? This comes up a lot at ayahuasca ceremonies where people want to have their ayahuasca experience or even psilocybin experience, but they're on antidepressants, for example. What do you say to them?
It really depends on the specific drug because drugs work different ways and they interact with psychedelics in different ways. So with ayahuasca in particular, if you're on any antidepressant, you shouldn't be on the antidepressant because ayahuasca contains monoamine oxidase inhibitors, which when combined with using a serotonin-based antidepressant, as they usually are, can lead to just too much serotonin in your brain, which will give rise to a whole bunch of uncomfortable symptoms, and even death if it's too intense. But that's probably unlikely with most doses, but it is possible actually. It's called, or a serotonin syndrome. That's what it's called. that said, with psilocybin and LSD, if you're on an SSRI antidepressant, which is the most commonly prescribed for unipolar depression, then if you're on it chronically, you'll actually dull your psychedelic experience because it downregulates your serotonin 2A receptors, so there's less of them. And so if you're on a chronic SSRI and you take psilocybin or LSD, you're not gonna feel it as much. And so usually in the context of studies, they ask people to go off them at least three to 4 weeks prior to the study. Otherwise, they just won't have the full spectrum of experiences. And then antipsychotics, et cetera, and it gets messy because they're very different in their pharmacology and et cetera.
Got it. Another question coming through about the serotonin receptors. Are there serotonin receptors in the intestines, and if so, do they play a role in the psychedelic effect?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, because actually the majority of serotonin is in your digestive system.
Oh, wow.
Crazy enough. A lot of it is down there. And in terms of psychedelics, we really don't know to what extent these so-called peripheral receptors in the rest of your body, which they're everywhere, serotonin receptors, and even the serotonin 2A receptor, what role they have in your experience. It's really unknown, and that's something that's very interesting. And related to this, psychedelics reduce inflammation, and there's evidence suggesting that serotonin 2A activating drugs can help with asthma. Crazy enough, because related to lung inflammation. And there's like mouse models where they're able to reduce asthma symptoms with a psychedelic, essentially, showing. Yeah, so there's a lot of crazy stuff, in terms of psychedelic effects on the body. I should say the serotonin 2A receptor has its highest amount in the brain, but serotonin itself is located in your digestive system to a large extent. But there is a complex brain, mind, body interaction, because as we know, they're not all distinct. They're all, essentially one component, one system that we divide based on our language to study them, and, et cetera.
Is there any kind of contraindications between MDMA and SSRIs?
Yes, definitely, because MDMA, so an SSRI stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And what that means is that it blocks the reuptake of serotonin from a synapse, from the connection between two neurons. And what that does, it blocks it from being cleared from it. So it's like there longer and able to activate neurons more. MDMA actually also is a reuptake inhibitor, and it increases the release. So if you get serotonin, your serotonin levels are already being regulated to be higher through an antidepressant. Then you take MDMA, which takes it up another notch, and includes dopamine and includes noradrenaline. You could set yourself up for like a overwhelming or intense experience. And again, with the risk of serotonin syndrome at higher doses. So I would definitely avoid, if you're on a SSRI or you just came off of one, be very careful with MDMA. And same with antipsychotics and stuff like this too.
Got it. Well, thank you so much for your time and sharing your depth of knowledge. You communicate these really complex scientific topics in a very easy to understand way. So I really appreciate that about you, Manesh. And that's why I love your YouTube channel. So folks, we're going to wrap up this call. How can people best stay in touch with you if they would like to discover more about your work or ask you some additional questions?
Yeah, for sure. So I have my YouTube channel, so the Psychedelic Scientist. I also have an Instagram page for that, which I'm also planning to be more active on in the near future. So again, this Instagram, the Psychedelic Scientist. And for me personally, my Twitter is the best way. So I am Girn Neuro is my handle, my Twitter handle. So MGIRNNEURO, Girn Neuro. So you can just DM me on Instagram or Twitter if you want to ask me something. My research, I tweet it, so you'll see on Twitter. And yeah, and if you want to learn more about psychedelics, check out my YouTube channel, and I have more videos to come in the future as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and knowledge. I want to wish you a beautiful rest of your day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and being present in this really fascinating conversation. Bye-bye, folks. Take care. Be well.
Thanks so much.